watching NotesIn9.
Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 134, using Java with XPages, Part 3. Tim Tripcony is the Lord of the Beans. Okay, as I said in the little subtitle there, Tim Tripcony is back on the show with the next part in the How to Use Java with XPages series. And Tim Tripcony has his own website, which is highly recommended reading. Even more might be anything he's commented on in Stack Overflow. Again, he works for bestmethods.com, an IBM business partner that just does all sorts of things. But as I think you can see in the video, Tim's really good at mentoring. And I think he's explaining, his last video was explained very well. This one's probably explained even better. And I'm a little scared to see the next one after that yet, but I will shortly. But again, he's great at mentoring. He's great at XPages. He's great at Java. So if you do need help, if you need some kind of like SWAT team to come in on a project or to help you with a certain skill set or something that you might be missing, you can certainly ring up Tim and his company, and I'm sure that they can do something for you. Okay, with that being said, we're going to go to Tim's demo, and Tim is going to expand on the last show. Now, remember, this is part 3 of a series. There's the first 2 shows. The last show, he really started building up these beans of how you can integrate them with your CRUD XPages application, and he's going to kind of like take this another step further. Along with the concept of you spend a little time to write some code up front, and then life would just be so much better after the fact, and easier to deal with, and less server-side JavaScript on your page, easier to maintain, etc. So with all that being said, let's go to the demo.
Welcome back. This interface will look familiar from the previous video, although in the previous video we were using this dark slate boot swatch. So for this one I decided to go with the slightly cheerier Ubuntu look and feel, which in boot swatch is called United. Also, in the previous video, this UI was getting a bit busy. Well, I guess it already had been. So because we're going to be adding more complicated features later, in the meantime, we're going to simplify. Right now, we've got a lot of wasted white space, but trust me, in future videos, it'll make sense what we're leaving room for here. We're also making sure that the app is looking a little bit less like a spreadsheet, which is always good, because if users want spreadsheets, just give them Excel. But if not, let's give our users apps instead of Excel in a browser. Anyway, enough of that. So the only thing that's changed at the theme layer is that we're extending the United theme instead of Slate. So let's get rid of that. And we're not doing the CRUD X page anymore. We're splitting things out into index and contact. So let's get rid of that. Let's dive into the source here. So index, the new launch page, is now basically just the view. It's just a table representation of the view, although we have added some pagination here, so we can see the Bootstrap friendly pager there. But other than that, the only thing really that's changed here is that now instead of pointing to the same page, we're pointing to our new contact page. And everything else is essentially what it already was. So let's get rid of that. And in the nav bar, also the only thing that's really changed is we're pointing to the new contact page for our new contact link. So let's get rid of that. So now let's look at our contact page. Pretty much everything here is what used to be on CRUD as well. So we got our fields here and such. We have our save button, but we also have a new edit button on the contact page. And you may have noticed in previous videos that the save button just always showed up. Whereas now we actually have a rendered attribute that determines whether or not the button will be visible. Additionally, our new edit button has a mutually exclusive rendered attribute. So save shows up if contact.edit mode, and edit shows up. If not, contact.edit mode. But edit mode is not a field. That's going to be an attribute of the state of the document, and we sort of sacrificed that notion in our previous iteration. So let's jump away from this and dive into the meat of why you're here, which is looking at some Java code. Just to recap how we got here. Previously, we had a contact model that was kind of a traditional bean with explicit getters and setters. And so anytime we wanted to add a field, we had to add a new explicit property and wrap it in two new methods. But by creating these two new layers, we were able to do away with that and make our class more flexible. So we created a base layer that implements data object. So we have a universal GetValue and setValue so that any property can be stored in this internal map. And then we can also tell the XPage what the data type is for each property and whether or not it should be read-only. On top of that layer, we created this notion of an abstract document map model, which sort of sucked out a lot of what used to have to be explicit at our top level model layer, and it gave us smarts for all models, such as being able to detect that there's an explicit ID in the URL, and knowing how to load up the map from existing item values, how to write item values back to the map when the user wants to save, and also a little bit of candy like query and post events. So today we're going to look at one additional layer. I've created what I decided to call an abstract smart document model. So we're extending what we already had, that abstract document map model. And you'll probably notice that all we're doing at this layer is simply re-implementing the four methods that comprise a data object. So again, our GetValue and setValue, getType, and isReadOnly. So we're overriding all of those at this layer. Why? Well, because there are advantages to having explicit getters and setters, and there are advantages to the flexibility of being able to define arbitrary properties. And so far, what we've looked at is only being able to choose one or the other. And we shouldn't have to choose. You've probably seen those commercials, I like and better. Well, that's what this layer does for us. This is our and layer. What we're using here is the bean utils portion of the Apache Commons library. Now, this is actually baked into the Notes client, but ironically, it isn't baked into Domino. I don't know why. It's intensely useful, but for some reason, it's in Notes, it's not in Domino. So if you're keeping up with the source code repository for this series, you'll notice that at this layer, I've included the necessary jars. There's just two of them. To make sure that bean utils will be a part of the Domino runtime, at least for the context of this app. So what's the point of this? Well, this property utils class, and this is actually in this layer, it's the only portion of bean utils that we're using. But property utils is something that is aware of the bean semantics, the notion of getters and setters and such, and allows us to determine things about the class that we're in based on the assumptions of these getter and setter conventions. So first, let's look at our new GetValue. Super always refers to the parent class. So there's a possibility that we'll revert to what our previous layers were already doing. But first, what we're going to try to do is use this property utils to get the current property value of whatever is passed in here. First name, last name, etc. And what property utils actually does is, because it knows about the bean conventions of explicit getters or setters, it's going to assume that whatever is passed in here has an explicit getter. So if it gets passed first name, it's going to try to call get first name, basically. And in that example, it's going to fail because there is no get first name method. So that's going to throw an error. Now, of course, in the Domino world, traditionally, we're used to all errors being bad. In Java, the reason that errors are typically called exceptions instead of error is because Java's whole flow management is based on the notion that you can check for things that are exceptions to the rule. So like in a workflow, you might have a primary approver and a backup approver if you detect that the primary approver is out of office. Well, that would be an exception to the rule. And so really, if you're doing your exception management properly in Java, you would have a try catch that is saying, try to find the primary approver. And if they're out of the office, that would throw an approver out of office exception. And then you would catch that and send it to the backup approver. So that's not an error. That's an exception. Anyway, just some Java philosophy. But the whole reason I went into that tangent is because I don't want you to get scared off by this model, seeing that, well, every time it doesn't find an explicit getter, it's going to throw an error. Well, no, it's going to throw an exception. It's an exception to the rule of bean conventions, the fact that there isn't a get first name. That's ordinarily a bean would have that, but in this case, this is an exception to that normal standard ordinary behavior. And because it is an exception to that, it's going to ask the map, because that's what our previous layers did. Anytime any property name was passed in, it would ask the map, well, do you have a first name stored? Do you have a last name stored? Do you have an email address? And so on. So all this does now is say, well, instead of always asking the map, at least check to see if there is an explicit getter. And if not, then ask the map. Conversely, then setValue does essentially the same thing. Instead of get property, it's just set property. So our preference is going to be to call an explicit setter. But if we don't have one, we know we can always fail over to the map. So again, that's not an error. Nothing went wrong. We just specified a default behavior and an alternate behavior if that default cannot be performed. So that's how we read and write values now, is we look for an explicit getter or an explicit setter. And if it doesn't have it, then we talk to the map. So what about get type and is read only? Well, another thing that this property utils class from the Apache Bean utils can do is it can check to see what the property type is of an explicit property. So if we were explicitly declaring first name and last name as fields, we would probably declare those as strings. If you jump all the way back to the first video in this series, that's what we did. We had string properties for first name and last name, and then explicit methods that would accept and return strings. So if this class still had that, then when this gets called, it's going to detect that and say, oh, well, this is a string. But if we had an explicit property for birthday, then get property type would probably return a Java date. But again, here the same rules apply. So if we don't have an explicit property with explicit getters and or setters, then it reverts again to the parent class behavior of just looking at the map. Is read only looks a little more complex, but there's actually not a whole lot more going on here. This notion of a property descriptor is sort of metadata about the notion of an explicit property. And so what this allows us to do is say, well, what if we have an explicit getter, but we don't have an explicit setter? So what would happen here is, in that scenario, this would succeed, but then our write method would be null. And so that means, well, by definition, it's read-only, because we have a getter, so we can ask for the value, but we don't have a setter, so there's no way for us to change it. Well, if there's something we can retrieve, but we can't overwrite, that is by definition read-only. So that's what all of this means, is do we have an explicit getter without a corresponding explicit setter? Now, if we don't even have an explicit getter, then this whole thing is going to trigger an exception to this rule of let's look for explicit first. And so if that occurs, then again, we fail over to the map. So what does all of this mean for our contact model? Well, what that means now is we can have an explicit notion of edit mode. At a previous layer, we were looking for an ID to determine whether this is a new document or an existing one. But now we can also look at the URL to see if we're passing an action. And if we are, and that action is edit, or if it's a new document. If a unit is empty, we don't have a document ID, therefore it's a new document, so we want it to be editable. Then we'll call edit. Well, what does edit do? All it does is set edit mode to true. The default value for all Booleans is false. So we're explicitly telling it, no, this should be true, because either the URL is telling us that it's in edit mode, or the fact that it's a new document dictates that it's in edit mode. And then we have our explicit getter and setter. As I think we mentioned in a previous video, but we may not have, usually your methods start with get and set, but in the case of Booleans, it's still set for the setter, because setters are always set. But the getter for a Boolean starts with is. So it's is edit mode instead of get edit mode. For all other types, it's always going to be get and set. But for Boolean, it's is and set. But now at this layer, we can override is read only yet again and say, is the document or the contact in edit mode? And if it isn't, then everything's read only. But if it is in edit mode, then fail over to the super. Ask the map, basically, right? So we had that previous layer that allowed us to intervene and say, well, okay, well, which field are they trying to edit? Oh, they're trying to edit job title. Do they have the HR role? No, okay, then it's read only. Now we have that at this layer. I've removed it for now, but the point is that we can now ask if the whole thing's in edit mode before we even bother to check for a specific properties rules for whether or not it's read only. So how does this all look in the UI? Well, now instead of having an edit button and a delete button, now I've just got a link going into the contact. So now the whole thing's in read, because we didn't pass in, if I were to give it an action equals edit, now it's in edit mode, because our constructor looked for that. But if it didn't have that, that method's never called. Therefore, when isReadOnly is asked for each field, before it looks for field-specific rules, it looks to see if the whole thing is in edit mode. And since it isn't, it always returns false for every field. But since our edit button calls the edit method of contact model, and all that edit does is it sets edit mode to true. Now everything is not read-only because it asks, is it in edit mode? And it is. So it fails over to see if there are rules for specific properties. And since I've removed the thing about do they have the HR role, or are they trying to edit the job title? In this case, if it's not in edit mode, then is read only will return true for every field. If it is in edit mode, is read only returns false for every field. Ergo, we can now edit all of them. Whereas when we're in read mode, none of it's editable. So as a result, we now have an explicit property that doesn't get written back to the document, but we can still bind to it on an X page. We can have a notion of mutually exclusive rendered attributes that say my save button shows up only in edit mode, my edit button shows up only in read mode, and that can all be part of the class without it getting written back to the document, because we don't want to store that they were in edit mode. We don't want that to be written to a document item. We want that to be part of our model logic. But if you're watching this and screaming at me, hey, all of that should be at the Smart Document model layer, congratulations, because you're absolutely right. In a subsequent video, you'll see that logic has been moved to that layer. And the reason is because what we're seeing so far isn't anything terribly fancy. We haven't actually gained anything that we don't already have out of the box with the standard Domino document data source. The standard data source has the notion of looking at the URL to see what's the document, what's the edit mode, and so on. And it already has the notion of being able to define arbitrary properties and bind to those with XPage components and so on. So we've been building up these layers, and in a sense, we haven't really gained anything. Well, stick with us, because in the next video we will have. We're going to add one more feature to this, and all of a sudden, I hope, it's going to kind of open your eyes to what's possible when you take these incremental shifts, where you're going to be writing very small amounts of code, and yet you're going to be doing powerful things in ways that are easier for users to understand and for maintenance programmers to maintain and for you to make additional changes to, and so on. Anyway, it's going to be awesome. It's going to rule. You're going to be really excited. But until then...
And that's the demo. I hope you like it. We've got another one lined up shortly. If you have any questions for me, here's my contact information, and I thank you for your time.